They called him broken, a burden, a man who should have stepped aside and disappeared. But on a frozen winter night, when the storm tore through Silver Ridge and threatened to bury everything he had left, Ethan Hale proved them all wrong. Not with sight, but with something far harder to destroy. And the woman who refused to let him fall? She wasn't there out of kindness. She was there because she'd been broken too, and she knew what it took to survive. If you want to see how two people the world gave up on built something the whole town couldn't tear down, stay with me until the end. And hey, drop a like and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story can travel. The fiddle screeched across the crowded hall like a knife dragged over tin, and Ethan Hale stood near the punch table wishing he could disappear into the floorboards. The harvest dance had been a tradition in Silver Ridge for as long as anyone could remember. Lanterns strung up in the town hall, sawdust on the floor, tables lined with donated pies and roasted corn. Everyone came, everyone danced, everyone pretended for one night that life on the frontier wasn't brutal and unforgiving. Ethan had stopped pretending 2 years ago. He stood with his back to the wall, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the table to orient himself, his head tilted just enough to track the movement of boots across wood, the rise and fall of voices, the clink of tin cups. He didn't need to see to know he was being avoided. He could feel it in the way conversation shifted when he moved, the way footsteps detoured around him like he was a piece of furniture no one wanted to bump into. "Poor man," someone murmured nearby. A woman's voice, low and pitying. "Shouldn't even be here," another replied. "What's he got to celebrate?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't turn. There was no point. They weren't wrong, exactly. He had nothing to celebrate. His ranch was bleeding money, his cattle herd had thinned to almost nothing, and he was 34 years old with a reputation that had gone from respected to pitied in the span of a single accident. The explosion at the old powder mill had taken his sight and, as far as most people were concerned, his usefulness along with it. He reached for his cup, fingers brushing the rim, and took a slow sip of lukewarm cider. Across the room, boots stomped in rhythm to the fiddle, and someone let out a whoop as the tempo picked up. Ethan had loved this dance once. He'd brought his late wife here 5 years running, spun her until she laughed so hard she couldn't breathe. But Claire had been dead 3 years now, taken by fever before he'd even lost his sight, and the memory of her felt more like a bruise than a comfort. "Ethan Hale, is that you?" He turned toward the voice, male, familiar, edged with something that wasn't quite friendly. Martin Crowley, younger brother to Victor Crowley, the biggest landowner in the county, and a man Ethan had learned to distrust long before the accident. "Martin," Ethan said evenly, "didn't think you'd show tonight." Martin's voice had that false brightness people used when they wanted to sound generous but weren't. "Brave of you, really. Didn't realize it took bravery to attend a dance." Martin laughed, too loud. "Well, you know how it is. Folks talk. They see you standing here alone, they wonder if maybe you'd be better off. I don't know, taking it easy, letting someone else handle things." Ethan's fingers tightened around the cup. "I'm handling things just fine. Are you?" Martin's voice dropped, turned sharper. "Because I heard your herd's down to what, 40 head? Maybe less? That's not much of a ranch, Ethan. My brother's been asking around, wondering if you might want to sell before things get worse. Tell your brother I'm not interested. He's offering fair price, more than fair considering—" "Considering what?" Ethan cut in, his voice flat. "Considering I can't see? Considering everyone in this town thinks I'm finished?" Martin hesitated, and Ethan could almost feel the man's discomfort radiating across the space between them. "I'm just saying you don't have to do this alone. Victor could take the land off your hands, give you enough to live on somewhere easier, somewhere you wouldn't have to—" I said no. The silence that followed was thick and awkward, and then Martin clapped him once on the shoulder, too hard, too familiar, and walked away. Ethan stood there, his pulse hammering in his ears, and hated every second of it. Hated that Martin was right, hated that he was standing in a room full of people who used to respect him, and now saw nothing but a man too stubborn to admit he was done. He set the cup down, turned toward the door, and had just started to make his way along the wall when a voice stopped him. "You planning to leave already?" It was a woman's voice, unfamiliar, with a faint roughness to it like she'd spent too many years talking over wind. Ethan paused, uncertain, his hand brushing the doorframe. "I don't believe we've met," he said carefully. "We haven't." A pause, and then she was closer, her voice clearer. Lydia Cross. I arrived in town 2 weeks ago. Lydia Cross. He'd heard the name. A widow, someone had said. Came in on the stage with a single trunk and no family, rented a room above the general store. People had whispered about her the same way they whispered about him, with curiosity and a little bit of suspicion. Ethan Hale, he said, though he figured she already knew. I know who you are. Then you know I'm not much for conversation. Good, she said. Neither am I. He frowned, unsure what to make of that, and then she stepped even closer. He could smell lavender soap, faint and clean, and underneath it something earthier, wood smoke maybe, or leather. I came over here, Lydia said, her voice low and steady, because I'm about to do something the whole room is going to talk about, and I thought you should know first. What are you? I'm going to ask you to dance. Ethan went still. For a moment, he thought he'd misheard her. You're what? You heard me. Lady, I don't know what you think you're doing, but I think I'm asking a man to dance, Lydia said, and there was no pity in her voice, no softness, just plain fact. And unless you've got some reason to say no that doesn't involve what other people think, I suggest you take my hand. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. He could feel the weight of the room shifting toward them, conversations faltering, attention sharpening. Someone nearby whispered something he couldn't quite catch, and someone else laughed, nervous and uncertain. Why? He asked quietly. Lydia didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was almost gentle. Because I've spent the last 2 weeks in this town being stared at like I'm a puzzle no one knows how to solve. And you're standing here like you're the only other person in the room who knows what that feels like. So I figured, why not? Ethan didn't move. His heart was pounding, his mind racing through 100 reasons to say no, and then Lydia's hand touched his, warm, calloused, steady, and he found himself nodding before he could think better of it. All right, he said. She led him out onto the floor, and the room went quiet. Not silent, exactly. The fiddle kept playing, someone coughed, boots shuffled, but quiet in the way that meant every eye was on them. Lydia placed his hand on her waist, took his other hand in hers, and started to move. Ethan stumbled once, caught himself, and then found the rhythm. It wasn't graceful. He couldn't see her feet, couldn't anticipate her turns. But Lydia moved with a kind of patient firmness that made it easier than it should have been. She didn't pull, didn't push, just guided. You're doing fine, she murmured. I'm stepping on your feet. Only twice so far. He almost smiled. Almost. And then the fiddle picked up speed and Lydia spun him. Just a quarter turn, nothing fancy. And for the first time in 2 years, Ethan felt like maybe he wasn't entirely invisible. When the song ended, she let go, stepped back, and said, Thank you. For what? For saying yes. And then she was gone, slipping back into the crowd before he could respond, leaving him standing there alone again. Except this time, the whispers weren't quite as sharp. Ethan didn't see Lydia again for 3 days, though he heard about her. Everyone in Silver Ridge had an opinion about the widow who danced with the blind rancher, and most of those opinions were unkind, too bold, too strange, too something. Ethan ignored them. He had bigger problems. The ranch was falling apart. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the slow, grinding way that made it impossible to ignore. Fences sagged. The barn roof leaked. His remaining cattle wandered too far because he couldn't ride out and bring them back the way he used to. His hired hand, a man named Caleb, did what he could, but Caleb was 62 and had a bad knee, and there was only so much one man could do. Ethan spent most of his days moving through the ranch by memory, his hands learning the terrain his eyes couldn't see anymore. He knew the distance from the house to the barn, 37 paces. He knew the creak of the third porch step, the way the wind sounded different when it came from the north. He knew where the water trough sat, where the tool shed door stuck, where the loose board in the corral fence needed replacing. But knowing wasn't the same as doing, and doing without sight was exhausting. On the third day after the dance, he was out near the fence line, trying to hammer a post back into the ground, when he heard footsteps approaching. Light, deliberate. You're doing that wrong, Lydia's voice said. Ethan straightened. the hammer still in his hand. Excuse me? The post. You're angling it too far west. It'll lean the whole section. He turned toward her voice, frowning. What are you doing here? I came to talk to you. About what? About work. Ethan set the hammer down, wiped his hands on his jeans. I'm not hiring. I'm not asking for wages, Lydia said. I'm asking for a trade. What kind of trade? I need a place to stay, somewhere outside of town where people aren't watching everything I do. You need help keeping this ranch from collapsing. Seems like we could help each other. Ethan laughed, short and humorless. Lady, I don't even know you. You danced with me. That's not the same thing. No, Lydia agreed, but it's a start. He shook his head. I can't pay you. I can barely keep Caleb on. I told you I'm not asking for pay. Just a roof and 3 meals. I'll work for that. Why? Ethan asked, and this time his voice was sharper. Why would you want to work on a failing ranch for a man who can't even see what needs fixing? Lydia was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its edge. Because I've been in rooms where people look at me like I'm something broken, and I'm tired of it. And because I think you're tired of it too. Ethan didn't respond. He wanted to say no. Wanted to tell her to leave, to find somewhere else, someone else. But the truth was, he was tired. Tired of fighting alone. Tired of pretending he didn't need help. 1 month, he said finally. Trial run. If it doesn't work, you leave. No argument. Deal, Lydia said. And just like that, Ethan Hale's life got a little more complicated. Schwartz. Lydia moved into the spare room the next morning carrying a single trunk and a bedroll. She didn't ask for help, didn't comment on the dust or the cracked window or the way the door stuck when you tried to close it. She just set her things down, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. Within 2 days, she'd patched the barn roof, repaired the corral fence, and reorganized the tool shed so Ethan could find things without fumbling. She worked fast, methodical, and didn't talk much unless she had something worth saying. Ethan found it unnerving at first. He was used to Caleb's constant chatter, the way the old man filled silence with stories and complaints. Lydia didn't do that. She just worked. On the 3rd day, she found him in the barn, trying to sort through a pile of harnesses that had gotten tangled over the winter. You're making a mess of that, she said. I'm aware. She knelt beside him, her hands moving over the leather straps with quick efficiency. You need a system. Something you can feel, not see. I have a system. Your system is hoping things stay where you left them. That's not a system. That's luck. Ethan scowled, but he didn't argue. He listened as she explained how to coil the harnesses, how to hang them so he'd always know which was which by touch alone. It was practical, simple, and he hated that he hadn't thought of it himself. You're good at this, he said grudgingly. I've had practice. Doing what? Lydia hesitated, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Ethan heard uncertainty in her voice. My husband ran a freight company back east. I kept the books, managed the warehouse. When he died, his partners took everything, said a woman couldn't run a business, so I left. They were idiots, Ethan said. Lydia laughed, soft and surprised. Yeah, they were. They worked in silence after that, and when the harnesses were sorted, Lydia stood, brushed the dust off her skirt, and said, I'm going into town tomorrow. You need anything? Why are you going to town? Supplies. And because I want to see what people are saying. They're saying plenty, Ethan muttered. None of it good. Let them talk. Lydia's voice was steady, unfazed. I've heard worse. She left before he could respond, and Ethan sat there in the barn, listening to her footsteps fade, and wondered, not for the first time, what he'd gotten himself into. What? Lydia came back from town the next afternoon with flour, sugar, nails, and a black eye. Ethan was on the porch when he heard the wagon pull up, the creak of the brake, the thud of boots hitting the ground. He stood, frowning. What happened? Nothing worth repeating, Lydia said, her voice clipped. Lydia, I said it's nothing, but Caleb, who'd been mending a saddle near the barn, spoke up. She got into it with Victor Crowley's men, saw the whole thing from across the street. Ethan's stomach dropped. What? They were giving her a hard time, Caleb continued, his voice grim. Saying she didn't belong here, that she should leave before she caused more trouble. She told them where they could shove their opinions, and one of them grabbed her arm. She shoved him back. He hit her. Ethan turned toward Lydia, his hands clenched. Did you hit him back? I tried, Lydia said. Didn't land it clean, but I got the message across. This isn't a joke. I know it's not a joke, Lydia snapped, and the anger in her voice was raw, real. I know exactly what it is. It's the same thing that's been happening to you for 2 years. They want you gone, Ethan. They want this land, and they're going to keep pushing until you give up or break. Ethan stood there, his jaw tight, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than resignation. He felt fury. They're not getting this land, he said quietly. Good, Lydia said. Then we better get to work. And they did. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan and Lydia fell into a rhythm. She became his eyes, describing the condition of the fences, the state of the cattle, the way the creek was running low. He taught her to read the land the way he'd learned as a boy, how to listen for the shift in the wind, how to feel the weight of coming rain, how to know when the cattle were restless. It wasn't perfect. They argued, stumbled, made mistakes, but slowly the ranch started to hold together. And slowly, people in town started to notice. They're saying you've got a woman living out there, Caleb mentioned one evening, his tone carefully neutral. Let them say it, Ethan replied. They're saying she's trouble. She's not. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You sure about that? Ethan didn't answer. He wasn't sure about anything anymore, but he knew one thing. Lydia Cross had shown up when no one else would, and she hadn't left. That had to count for something. The first snow came early that year, dusting the ridge in white by mid-October. Ethan woke to the cold, the stillness that came with snow, and the sound of Lydia already up and moving in the kitchen. Storm's coming, she said when he came downstairs. Big one, from the feel of it. How big? Big enough that we need to bring the cattle in close. All of them. Ethan nodded. He'd been expecting this. Winter on the frontier was unforgiving, and a bad storm could scatter a herd, kill calves, destroy months of work in a single night. They spent the day riding out, Lydia guiding him as they moved the cattle into the pasture nearest the barn. It was slow, exhausting work, and by the time they finished, the sky had turned the color of old steel. We're not done, Lydia said as they unsaddled the horses. Fences need checking, barn needs securing, and we need firewood. A lot of it. I know. Then let's move. They worked until dark, and then past dark, moving by lantern light and memory. By the time they stumbled back into the house, Ethan's hands were numb, his body aching, but the ranch was as ready as it was going to be. Lydia made coffee, strong and bitter, and they sat at the kitchen table in silence, too tired to talk. You did good today, Ethan said finally. So did you. He almost smiled. Almost. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and Ethan knew the storm was close. What he didn't know was that it would test everything they'd built and everything they were starting to become. The storm hit 3 days later, and it hit hard. Ethan woke to the sound of wind slamming against the house like fists, the walls groaning under the pressure. He sat up, disoriented for a moment, then swung his legs out of bed and reached for his boots. The floor was cold enough to sting through his socks. Lydia? He called out. Already up. Her voice came from downstairs, tense and sharp. We've got problems. He made his way down, one hand trailing the banister, and found her in the kitchen pulling on her coat. The stove was cold. She hadn't bothered with a fire. How bad? He asked. Bad. Wind's tearing at the barn roof, and I can hear the cattle moving. They're spooked. Ethan grabbed his coat off the hook, his jaw set. We need to get out there before they scatter. I know. They pushed out into the storm together, and the wind hit Ethan like a wall. It roared in his ears, drowning out everything else, and he felt Lydia's hand grab his arm, steadying him. Stay close, she shouted over the noise. He nodded, though he wasn't sure she could see it, and they moved forward into the chaos. The world outside was nothing but sound and cold. Snow whipped across Ethan's face, stinging his skin, and the wind pulled at his coat like it wanted to rip it off. He couldn't see, had never been able to, but now it didn't matter because Lydia couldn't either. The storm had leveled them. Barn first, Lydia yelled, and Ethan followed the pull of her hand, his boots crunching through snow that was already ankle deep. When they reached the barn, Lydia shoved the door open and they stumbled inside. The air was only marginally calmer, the roof rattling overhead, and Ethan could hear the horses shifting nervously in their stalls. "I need to check the loft," Lydia said, breathing hard. "That's where the roof's weakest." "I'll handle the horses." She didn't argue, just moved past him, and Ethan made his way to the stalls by memory. The first horse, his mare, Greta, whinnied when he approached, her breath warm against his hand. "Easy," he murmured, running his palm along her neck. "You're all right. We're all right." But he wasn't sure that was true. Above him, he heard Lydia moving in the loft, the creak of boards, the scrape of something heavy being dragged. Then a crack, sharp and loud, and Lydia swore. "What happened?" Ethan called up. "Beam split. I need something to brace it, or the whole section's coming down." Ethan's mind raced. "There's a post in the back corner, near the tool bench. Can you reach it?" "I'll try." He heard her moving again, fast and reckless, and his chest tightened. If that roof came down while she was up there— "Got it!" Lydia shouted, and then there was the sound of wood slamming into place, followed by the screech of nails being driven in. It wasn't elegant, but it held. Lydia climbed back down, her face flushed, her hands scraped raw. "That'll last the night, maybe." "Good enough," Ethan said, though his voice was tight. They stood there for a moment, catching their breath, and then the wind shifted, and with it came a new sound, cattle, bawling in panic. Lydia's head snapped toward the door. "They're running! Damn it!" Ethan moved toward the barn entrance, his heart sinking. If the herd scattered in this storm, they'd lose half of them by morning, maybe more. "We have to go after them," Lydia said, already pulling the door open. "In this?" Ethan gestured toward the storm outside. "We'll get lost out there, or worse. And if we don't, we lose everything." Ethan hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to stay put, to wait it out. But Lydia was already stepping into the snow, and he knew she was right. They didn't have a choice. He followed her out into the storm. The cattle had broken through the fence on the north side of the pasture. The posts snapped clean by the wind. Lydia spotted the gap first, shouting over the roar of the storm, and they pushed toward it, fighting every step. The snow was deeper now, past their knees in places, and the cold was vicious, biting through their coats and numbing their hands. "I see them!" Lydia yelled, pointing into the dark. "They're heading toward the ravine." Ethan's stomach dropped. The ravine was a steep drop-off half a mile north, hidden by brush and easy to miss even in daylight. "If the cattle went over the edge, we have to turn them," he shouted back. "I know!" They split up, Lydia moving wide to the left, Ethan pushing straight ahead. He couldn't see the cattle, but he could hear them, the thunder of hooves, the panicked calls, and he used that, angling himself to cut them off. His boots slipped in the snow, and he went down hard, his shoulders slamming into the frozen ground. Pain shot through him, sharp and immediate, but he pushed himself up and kept moving. "Ethan!" Lydia's voice, distant and frantic. "I'm fine," he lied, stumbling forward. He reached the edge of the herd and started yelling, waving his arms, anything to turn them. For a moment it didn't work. They just kept running, blind with fear. But then Lydia appeared on the other side, her voice cutting through the storm, and the lead cow hesitated. That was all it took. The herd slowed, turned, and started moving back toward the pasture. Ethan and Lydia worked in tandem, pushing the cattle toward the gap in the fence, their voices hoarse from shouting. It took an eternity, every minute stretching out like an hour, but finally the last cow stumbled through, and Lydia grabbed a length of broken fencing and started lashing it across the gap. "Help me!" she shouted, and Ethan moved to her side, holding the post steady while she tied it down. His hands were so cold he could barely feel them, but he didn't let go. When it was done, they stood there, panting, the storm still raging around them. "We need to get back," Lydia said, her voice shaking. Ethan nodded, too exhausted to speak, and they started the long walk back to the house. They made it halfway before Ethan's legs gave out. He didn't mean to fall. One moment he was walking, the next his knee buckled, and he went down into the snow, hard enough to knock the wind out of him. He tried to push himself up, but his arms wouldn't cooperate, and the cold had seeped so deep into his bones that he couldn't feel his fingers anymore. "Ethan!" Lydia was beside him in an instant, her hands on his shoulders. "Get up, you have to get up." "I'm trying," he rasped, but his body wasn't listening. "Come on!" She grabbed his arm, hauling him upright with a strength that surprised him, and slung his arm over her shoulders. "Lean on me. We're not stopping." "Lydia, I said we're not stopping." They moved together, Lydia half dragging him through the snow, and Ethan hated every second of it. Hated that he'd collapsed, hated that she had to carry him, hated that he was proving every whisperer in town right. He was a burden, a liability, a man who couldn't even save his own cattle without falling apart. "I can't," he started, but Lydia cut him off. "Yes, you can. Shut up and walk." So he did. By the time they reached the house, Ethan was barely conscious, his body shaking so hard his teeth rattled. Lydia kicked the door open, hauled him inside, and dumped him into the chair nearest the stove. She moved fast, her hand shaking as she stuffed kindling into the firebox and struck a match. The fire caught, and she fed it until it roared, then turned back to Ethan. "Get your coat off," she ordered. He fumbled with the buttons, his fingers clumsy and useless, and Lydia batted his hands away, doing it herself. She pulled the coat off, then his boots, then wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and shoved a cup of something hot into his hands. "Drink," she said. He drank. It was coffee, strong and bitter, and it burned going down, but it helped. Lydia knelt in front of him, her face pale, her hair plastered to her forehead. "You scared me out there." "I'm fine," Ethan said, his voice rough. "You're not fine, you collapsed." I got back up. "Because I pulled you up." Lydia's voice cracked, and she looked away, her jaw tight. "You can't do that again, Ethan. You can't just fall apart and expect me to—" "I didn't expect anything," Ethan interrupted, his voice harder than he meant it to be. "I didn't ask you to come here. I didn't ask for your help. You chose this." Lydia stared at him, her eyes bright with something that might have been anger or might have been tears, and then she stood, turned, and walked out of the room. Ethan sat there, the blanket pulled tight around him, and felt like the worst kind of fool. The storm raged for 2 more days, and during that time, Ethan and Lydia barely spoke. They moved around each other like ghosts, doing what needed to be done, feeding the animals, checking the fences, keeping the fire going. But the easy rhythm they'd built over the past month was gone, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than the snow piling up outside. Ethan hated it. Hated the distance, hated that he'd put it there with his damn pride and his inability to just say thank you. But he didn't know how to fix it, didn't know how to take back words that had already been said. On the 3rd day, the storm finally broke. The wind died down, the snow stopped, and the world outside went quiet in that eerie way it always did after a blizzard. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, his breath misting in the cold air, and listened to the stillness. "It's over," Lydia said from behind him. He turned toward her voice. "Yeah." She came to stand beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating off her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I'm sorry," Ethan said finally, "for what I said. You didn't deserve that." Lydia was quiet, and then she let out a long breath. "You weren't entirely wrong. I did choose this, but I didn't choose it because I thought it would be easy, Ethan. I chose it because I thought maybe we could help each other, and I still think that, even when you're being an ass." Ethan huffed a laugh, surprised. "I'll try to be less of an ass." "Good, because I'm not going anywhere." He nodded, something tight in his chest loosening just a fraction. "Okay." They stood there together, the cold biting at their faces, and Ethan realized that somewhere along the way, this had stopped being just about survival. It had become something more. He just wasn't sure what to do about it. The week after the storm was brutal. The snow had drifted so high in places that it took 2 days just to dig out the barn, and the cattle were in bad shape. Thin, skittish, with 2 calves lost to the cold. Ethan and Lydia worked from dawn until long after dark, their bodies aching, their hands cracked and bleeding from the cold. Caleb came by on the 5th day, riding up on his old mule with a sack of supplies from town. He took one look at the ranch, the patched fences, the cleared pathways, the cattle huddled together in the pasture, and let out a low whistle. "You two did all this?" he asked. "Most of it," Lydia said, leaning on a shovel. Caleb shook his head. "I'll be damned. Thought for sure the storm would have finished you off." "Not yet," Ethan said, and there was a grim satisfaction in his voice. Caleb handed over the sack. "Got some flour, beans, a little bacon. Town's still snowed in, but the mercantile managed to open yesterday." "Thanks," Lydia said, taking the sack. "What's the talk in town?" Caleb hesitated, and Ethan's stomach sank. "What is it?" "Victor Crowley's been asking around again, wanting to know how you fared in the storm. Word is, he's planning to make another offer on the land. He can plan all he wants, Ethan said flatly. I'm not selling. That's what I told him, Caleb said. But he's not the kind of man who takes no for an answer. You know that. Ethan did know that. Victor Crowley had been circling the ranch like a vulture for 2 years, waiting for Ethan to fail. And every time Ethan managed to hold on, Crowley's offers got more aggressive, his tactics more underhanded. Let him come, Lydia said, her voice hard. We'll deal with him. Caleb looked between the two of them, his expression unreadable. You're playing a dangerous game, Lydia. I'm not playing anything, she said. I'm just living my life. If that bothers people, that's their problem. Caleb shook his head, but he didn't argue. He climbed back onto his mule and rode off, leaving Ethan and Lydia standing in the snow. He's right, you know, Ethan said quietly. This is dangerous. Crowley's not just going to back off because we survived one storm. I know, Lydia said, but I'm not backing off either. Ethan turned toward her, wishing for the 1,000th time that he could see her face, read her expression. Why are you doing this? Really? Lydia was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. Because when I got to this town, I was running. From my husband's death, from the people who stole everything I built, from the idea that I was just supposed to disappear and let them win. And then I saw you at that dance, standing there like you were daring the whole room to look away. And I thought, if he's still fighting, maybe I can too. Ethan's throat tightened. I'm not sure I'm worth fighting for. That's not your call to make, Lydia said. It's mine. And for the first time since the storm, Ethan felt something close to hope. 2 weeks later, Victor Crowley came calling. Ethan was in the barn repairing a saddle when he heard the horses approaching. 3 of them, from the sound of it, moving at a leisurely pace. He set the saddle down and stepped outside, Lydia already at his side. Who is it? He asked quietly. Crowley, Lydia said, her voice tight. And 2 of his men. Ethan's jaw clenched. Stay close. Victor Crowley was a tall man with a voice that carried, smooth and confident in a way that set Ethan's teeth on edge. He dismounted with the ease of someone who'd never had to worry about falling, and his boots crunched in the snow as he walked toward them. Ethan, hail, Crowley said, and there was false warmth in his tone. Good to see you still standing. Heard the storm was rough out here. We managed, Ethan said. So I see. Crowley's gaze shifted. Ethan could feel it, and he knew the man was looking at Lydia. And you must be Mrs. Cross. Martin's told me about you. I'm sure he has, Lydia said coolly. Crowley chuckled. Direct. I like that. Though I have to say it's unusual for a woman to take up residence on a bachelor's ranch. People talk, you know. Let them, Lydia said. Indeed. Crowley's tone shifted, became more businesslike. Well, I won't waste your time. I'm here to make you an offer, Ethan, a generous one. I'm not interested, Ethan said. You haven't heard the terms yet. Don't need to. Crowley sighed like Ethan was a child refusing to eat his vegetables. Look, I understand pride. I do. But you've got to be realistic. You lost cattle in that storm. Your fences are barely holding. You're one bad season away from losing everything, and we both know it. I'm offering you a way out. Cash. Enough to start fresh somewhere easier. I don't want easy, Ethan said. I want my land. Your land is dying, Crowley said, and now there was an edge to his voice. And you're too stubborn to see it. Maybe, Ethan said, but it's still mine. Crowley was quiet for a moment, and then he laughed, low and humorless. All right, have it your way. But when you come crawling back, and you will, don't expect the offer to be as good. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Mrs. Cross? A word of advice. This town doesn't take kindly to women who don't know their place. Might be worth keeping that in mind. I'll keep it in mind, Lydia said, her voice like ice. Right next to all the other useless advice I've been given. Crowley's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Ethan thought the man might say something else. But then he climbed back onto his horse, motioned to his men, and rode off. Lydia let out a slow breath. That went well. He's not going to stop, Ethan said. I know. This is only going to get worse. I know that too. Lydia turned toward him, and her voice was steady. But I'm not leaving, Ethan. Not because of him, and not because of what people in town think. So unless you're planning to throw me out, we're in this together. Ethan stood there, the weight of her words settling over him, and realized that somewhere along the way, he'd stopped thinking of Lydia as temporary. She'd become part of the ranch, part of his life, and the thought of losing her, whether to Crowley's threats or her own choice to leave, was unbearable. "I'm not throwing you out," he said quietly. "Good," Lydia said. "Then let's get back to work." The days that followed were tense, waiting for Crowley's next move. But it didn't come. Instead, something else happened, something Ethan hadn't expected. People in town started talking. Not just gossip, but real talk. Some of it was ugly, sure. Whispers about Lydia and Ethan living under the same roof, speculation about what they were to each other. But some of it was different. A few people, not many, but a few, started saying that maybe Ethan Hale wasn't finished after all. That maybe the blind rancher and the widow from back east were proving everyone wrong. Caleb brought the news one afternoon, his face carefully neutral. "You got some folks on your side now. Not a lot, but some." "Who?" Ethan asked, skeptical. "Old Mrs. Brennan, for one. Said she admires what Lydia's doing. And Tom Holloway at the feed store mentioned he'd extend you credit if you needed it. Said any man who could survive that storm deserves a chance." Ethan didn't know what to say. He'd spent so long being invisible, being dismissed, that the idea of people actually rooting for him felt foreign. "Don't let it go to your head," Caleb added with a dry smile. "You've still got plenty who think you're crazy." "I'll take what I can get," Ethan said. That night he told Lydia about it over supper. She listened, her expression unreadable, and then she smiled, small and private. "Maybe we're not as alone as we thought," she said. "Maybe not," Ethan agreed. And for the first time in a long time, he let himself believe it. The ranch wasn't out of danger, not by a long shot. Winter still had teeth, the cattle were still too thin, and Crowley was still circling. But Ethan and Lydia had something now that they hadn't had before. They had each other. And that, Ethan was starting to realize, might just be enough. March came in cold and mean, the kind of weather that made promises of spring feel like lies. The snow had mostly melted, leaving the ground a churned mess of mud and half-frozen slush that sucked at boots and made every step a fight. Ethan stood on the porch in the pre-dawn dark, listening to the drip of water off the roof, the restless shift of cattle in the pasture, and felt the weight of everything they still had to do pressing down on his shoulders. They'd made it through winter, barely, but survival wasn't the same as success, and Ethan knew the real test was still coming. Spring meant calving season, meant repairs that couldn't wait any longer, meant proving to the bank and to himself that this ranch could actually turn a profit. Behind him, the door creaked open, and Lydia stepped out, a cup of coffee in each hand. She pressed one into his palm without a word, and they stood there together, drinking in silence. "Caleb's coming by today," Lydia said after a while. "Said he wanted to talk to you about the auction." Ethan's stomach tightened. The cattle auction in Silver Ridge happened twice a year, spring and fall, and it was where ranchers made or broke their year. If Ethan could get his herd there in good condition, if the cattle sold well, he might actually be able to pay off some of his debts, maybe even start building instead of just holding on. But that was a lot of ifs. "We're not ready," Ethan said flatly. "We've got 6 weeks," Lydia said. "We'll be ready. The herd's too thin. Half of them are still recovering from winter, and we lost—" "I know what we lost," Lydia interrupted, her voice firm. "And I know what we've got left. It's not perfect, but it's something. And something is better than nothing." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to list all the reasons they were going to fail, but he swallowed the words. Lydia had heard them all before, and she was still here. That had to count for something. "All right," he said. "We'll try." "That's the spirit," Lydia said dryly, and Ethan almost smiled. Caleb showed up around mid-morning, riding his mule through the mud, with the kind of patient stubbornness that came from 6 decades of frontier life. He dismounted with a grunt, tied the mule to the porch rail, and climbed the steps slowly, his bad knee making him wince. "You look like hell," he said to Ethan by way of greeting. "Good morning to you too," Ethan replied. Caleb snorted, then turned to Lydia. "And you look like you've been working too hard." "Probably because I have," Lydia said, but there was no heat in it. They went inside, and Lydia put on a fresh pot of coffee while Caleb settled into a chair at the kitchen table. Ethan sat across from him, waiting. "So," Caleb said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket, I've been doing some asking around, talked to a few folks about the auction, got a sense of what prices are looking like this year. And? Ethan asked. And it's not great, Caleb said bluntly. A lot of ranchers took heavy losses over the winter. Supply is going to be higher than usual, which means prices are going to drop. You're looking at maybe $12, $13 a head if you're lucky. Ethan's jaw tightened. He'd been hoping for 15, maybe 16. 12 would barely cover his expenses. There's more, Caleb continued, his voice careful. Victor Crowley's planning to bring a big herd to auction. Word is he's going to flood the market, drive prices down even further. Make it so the smaller ranchers can't compete. Lydia set the coffee pot down hard enough to rattle the stove. That son of a... Language, Caleb said mildly. He's trying to squeeze us out, Lydia said, ignoring him. He knows if Ethan can't sell, he can't pay the bank. And if he can't pay the bank, then I lose the ranch, Ethan finished quietly. The three of them sat in silence, the weight of it settling over the table like fog. There's got to be something we can do, Lydia said finally. Some way to get a better price. Caleb rubbed his jaw, thinking. Well, there's one thing. It's not a guarantee, but it might help. What? Ethan asked. Quality over quantity, Caleb said. Crowley's going to bring numbers, but if you bring cattle that are in better shape, healthier, better fed, buyers will notice. They'll pay more for stock they know is going to last. Ethan leaned back in his chair, turning the idea over in his mind. It made sense, but it also meant a hell of a lot of work. They'd have to put weight on the cattle, get them looking their best, and that meant grain, supplements, constant attention. We don't have the money for extra feed, Ethan said. Tom Holloway might extend you credit, Caleb said. He's been asking after you, might be willing to help. Lydia looked at Ethan, her expression unreadable. It's a gamble. Everything's a gamble, Ethan said, but at least this one's got a chance. Then we do it, Lydia said. Caleb nodded, satisfied. I'll talk to Tom, see what we can work out. After Caleb left, Ethan and Lydia stood on the porch again, looking out at the muddy pasture and the cattle scattered across it. 43 head all told. Not much of a herd, but it was theirs. 6 weeks, Lydia said. Think we can pull it off? I don't know, Ethan admitted, but I'm willing to try. Lydia smiled, small and determined. Good, because I didn't come all this way to watch you quit now. The next 6 weeks were brutal. They worked every daylight hour and most of the dark ones too, pushing themselves and the cattle to the edge of what was possible. Tom Holloway came through with credit for grain and mineral supplements, and Lydia rationed it out carefully, making sure every cow got just enough to start putting on weight without wasting a single kernel. Ethan threw himself into the work with a kind of desperate focus. He couldn't see the cattle, couldn't judge their condition by eye, but he learned to do it by touch, running his hands over their ribs, feeling for muscle and fat, listening to the sound of their breathing. Lydia described what she saw, filling in the gaps, and together they cataloged every animal, noting which ones were improving and which ones were lagging. There were setbacks. A cow came down with hoof rot and had to be treated daily. Another got into a tangle with barbed wire and tore a gash in her shoulder that took a week to heal. One of the calves born late in the season didn't make it, and they buried it on a cold morning that felt like a punch to the gut. But there were small victories, too. The herd started to look better. Not great, but better. Their coats had more shine, their movements were stronger, and when Lydia walked through the pasture counting, she reported that they were holding their weight. We're getting there, she said one evening, her voice tired but satisfied. Not fast enough, Ethan muttered. It's never fast enough for you, Lydia said, but we're still getting there. Ethan wanted to believe her. Some days he did. Other days, he lay awake at night counting everything that could still go wrong, and the list felt endless. 4 weeks before the auction, Victor Crowley made his next move. Ethan was in the barn, organizing tack, when he heard horses approaching. 3 of them again, moving slow. He stepped outside and Lydia appeared at his side almost immediately, her hand resting on the pitchfork she'd been using to muck out stalls. It's Crowley, she said, her voice tight. And his brother Martin, and someone I don't recognize. Stay calm, Ethan said, though his own pulse was hammering. Crowley dismounted with the same easy confidence as before, but this time there was something sharper in his voice when he spoke. Ethan, Mrs. Cross. Beautiful day, isn't it? What do you want, Crowley? Ethan asked. Straight to business. I can respect that. Crowley's boots crunched in the gravel as he walked closer. "I'm here to make things clear. You're planning to bring your herd to auction, and that's your right. But I want you to understand what you're up against." "We understand just fine," Lydia said. Crowley ignored her, addressing Ethan directly. "I've got over 200 head coming to market. Prime stock, well-fed, well-bred. They're going to set the standard, and anything that doesn't measure up is going to get passed over. Now, I'm not saying your cattle won't sell. I'm just saying they won't sell for much." "We'll take our chances," Ethan said. "Will you?" Crowley's tone shifted, became almost conversational. "Because here's the thing, Ethan. I've been talking to the bank. They're concerned about your loan, wondering if you're going to be able to make your payment this year. And I told them, honestly, I said that I wasn't sure, that it might be kinder to everyone involved if they just called it in now, before you sink any deeper." Ethan went very still. "You talked to the bank about my loan?" "I'm on the board," Crowley said smoothly. "It's my job to protect their interests. And right now their interests are not aligned with keeping you afloat." Lydia took a step forward, her knuckles white around the pitchfork handle. "You bastard!" "Mrs. Cross, I understand you're upset, but—" "No," Lydia cut him off, her voice shaking with fury. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to smile and pretend you're helping while you're cutting us off at the knees." Crowley's expression hardened. "I'm offering you a way out. One last time. Sell me the land now, and you walk away with enough to start over. Turn me down, and I'll make sure the bank calls your loan the day after auction. You'll lose everything, Ethan. The ranch, the cattle, all of it." "Get off my property," Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous. "Think about it," Crowley said, unfazed. "You've got until auction day to make the smart choice." He climbed back onto his horse, motioned to his men, and rode off, leaving Ethan and Lydia standing in the yard, both of them trembling with rage. "He can't do that," Lydia said, her voice raw. "He can't just—" "He can," Ethan said bitterly. "If he's on the bank board, he can do whatever he wants. Then we fight him." "How?" Ethan turned toward her, his face bleak. "How do we fight a man who controls the money, controls the market, controls everything?" Lydia didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was steady. "We win at auction. We bring the best damn cattle Silver Ridge has ever seen, and we sell them for more than he thinks we can. And we prove that he doesn't control us." Ethan wanted to believe her, but the fear was creeping in now, cold and relentless, whispering that maybe Crowley was right. Maybe this was a fight he couldn't win. "I don't know if we can do this," he said quietly. "Yes, you do," Lydia said. "You've known since the day I got here. You're just scared. And that's fine. I'm scared too. But we're doing it anyway." Ethan stood there, torn between the urge to give up and the stubborn refusal to let Crowley win. And finally, he nodded. "All right," he said. "We do it." Lydia let out a breath. "Good. Because I already told Caleb we'd need his help moving the herd to town, and I wasn't planning to take it back." Despite everything, Ethan almost laughed. The storm that hit 2 weeks before the auction wasn't supposed to happen. Spring storms were rare this late in the season, but when Ethan woke to the sound of wind battering the house and rain hammering the roof, he knew they were in trouble. "Lydia!" he shouted, already pulling on his boots. She was downstairs in seconds, her face pale. "It's bad. Really bad." They stumbled outside into chaos. The wind was vicious, tearing at their clothes and making it almost impossible to stand. Rain lashed down in sheets, turning the ground into a slick, muddy nightmare. And in the distance, Ethan could hear the cattle bawling in panic. "The fence!" Lydia shouted over the roar. "It's not going to hold!" "We have to move them," Ethan yelled back. "Get them into the barn before they scatter." They ran toward the pasture, slipping and sliding in the mud, and Ethan's heart sank when he heard the crack of wood snapping. The fence was going down. "They're running!" Lydia screamed, and Ethan could hear it now, the thunder of hooves, the terrified calls, the herd breaking apart. "Go left!" Ethan shouted. "Turn them toward the barn!" Lydia didn't argue. She took off, her boots splashing through the mud, and Ethan went right, moving by instinct and sound. He could hear the cattle ahead of him, could feel the vibration of their hooves through the ground, and he pushed himself harder, faster, ignoring the pain in his lungs and the way his boots kept slipping. He reached the edge of the herd and started yelling, waving his arms, trying to turn them. For a moment it worked. The lead cow slowed, hesitated, But then a crack of thunder split the air, and the herd bolted again, scattering in every direction. "Ethan!" Lydia's voice distant and desperate. "I'm here!" he shouted back, but the wind tore his words away. He kept moving, kept pushing, and then his boot caught on something. A root, a rock. He didn't know. And he went down hard, his face slamming into the mud. Pain exploded in his shoulder, sharp and immediate, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. "Ethan!" Lydia was beside him, her hands on his arms. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," he gasped, though he wasn't sure that was true. "Can you stand?" He tried, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. The fall had knocked something loose inside him, and the exhaustion he'd been fighting for weeks came crashing down all at once. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Lydia said, her voice fierce. "You're getting up, and we're finishing this. Lydia, I didn't drag your ass out of the last storm just to lose you in this one," she snapped. "Now get up." Ethan grabbed her arm, let her haul him to his feet, and they stumbled forward together. The cattle were still running, still panicking, but Lydia's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding, and slowly, painfully slowly, they started to turn. It took hours. Hours of shouting, running, slipping, falling, getting back up. Hours of rain soaking through their clothes and mud caking their boots, and exhaustion eating away at every reserve they had left. But somehow, impossibly, they got the herd into the barn. When the last cow was inside, Lydia slammed the barn door shut and leaned against it, gasping for breath. Ethan collapsed onto a hay bale, his whole body shaking. "We did it," Lydia said, her voice raw. Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. The weight of everything, the storm, the fear, the months of struggle, crashed over him, and for the first time in years he felt tears burning at the corners of his eyes. "Ethan?" Lydia's voice was softer now, concerned. "I can't keep doing this," he said, and the words came out broken. "I can't keep fighting and losing and fighting again. I'm tired, Lydia. I'm so damn tired." Lydia crossed the barn, knelt in front of him, and took his hands in hers. They were cold, trembling, covered in mud. "I know you're tired," she said. "I'm tired too, but we're not losing. Not yet. And not ever if I have anything to say about it." "Why?" Ethan asked, his voice cracking. "Why do you keep doing this? Why do you care so much?" Lydia was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady but thick with emotion. "Because when I first got here, I was broken. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered, and then I met you, and I saw a man who was broken too, but who hadn't given up, and I thought, if he can keep going, maybe I can too. So yeah, I care. Because you reminded me that broken doesn't mean finished." Ethan's breath hitched, and he gripped her hands tighter. "I don't feel strong, Lydia. I feel like I'm barely holding on." "Then hold on to me," she said simply, "and I'll hold on to you, and maybe that'll be enough." They sat there in the barn, rain drumming on the roof, the cattle shifting and settling around them. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan let himself lean on someone else. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind a world washed clean and exhausted. Ethan and Lydia checked the herd. Miraculously, they'd only lost 2 cows, both older animals that had been weak before the storm. The rest were shaken, but alive. They spent the next week repairing fences, checking for injuries, getting the cattle back out to pasture. The work was hard, relentless, but it felt different now. Lighter, somehow. Like something between them had shifted in that barn, something that couldn't be taken back. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lydia spoke. "Ethan, I need to tell you something." He turned toward her voice, waiting. "When I came here, I told myself it was just temporary, a place to hide until I figured out what came next. But it's not temporary anymore. This ranch, this life, it's what I want. And you—" She paused, and Ethan heard the hesitation in her voice. "You're what I want too, if you'll have me." Ethan's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. "Lydia, you don't have to say anything right now," she said quickly. "I just needed you to know. Before the auction, before whatever happens next, I needed you to know." Ethan reached out, found her hand, and held it. "I'm not good at this. I don't know how to—" "You don't have to be good at it," Lydia said. "You just have to be here." "I'm here," Ethan said, "and I'm not going anywhere." They sat together as the light faded, the ranch quiet around them, and Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. The week before the auction, Ethan barely slept. He'd lie awake in the dark, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around him, his mind churning through every detail, every possible disaster. The cattle could fall sick, the weather could turn, Crowley could pull some trick at the auction that Ethan hadn't anticipated. The list of things that could go wrong felt infinite, and the weight of it pressed down on him like a physical thing. On the third night of this, he gave up on sleep entirely and went downstairs to make coffee. The kitchen was dark except for the moonlight coming through the window, and he moved through it by memory, his hands finding the pot, the tin of grounds, the matches for the stove. He was just getting the fire started when he heard footsteps on the stairs. "Can't sleep either?" Lydia's voice came from the doorway. Ethan turned toward her. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't. I've been up for an hour." She crossed to the table and sat down with a sigh. "My mind won't shut off." "Yeah," Ethan said. "I know the feeling." They sat in silence while the coffee brewed, and when it was ready, Ethan poured 2 cups and brought them to the table. Lydia wrapped her hands around hers like she was trying to soak up the warmth. "Talk to me," she said after a moment. "Tell me what you're thinking." Ethan took a sip of coffee, considering. "I'm thinking that we've done everything we can. The cattle look better than I dared hope. Caleb says they're in good condition. Tom says the market's looking up. All the pieces are there." "But?" Lydia prompted. "But I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," Ethan admitted. "Crowley's been too quiet. He made his threats and then nothing. That's not like him." Lydia was quiet for a moment. "You think he's planning something?" "I know he is. I just don't know what." "Then we stay sharp," Lydia said. "We watch for it. And we don't let him rattle us." Easier said than done. "Most things are," Lydia said, and there was a faint smile in her voice. "But we've gotten pretty good at doing hard things, haven't we?" Ethan huffed a laugh despite himself. "I suppose we have." They finished their coffee in companionable silence, and when the sky started to lighten outside, they went out together to start the day's work. There was still so much to do: final checks on the cattle, repairs to the wagon they'd used to haul supplies to town, preparations for the 3-day trip to Silver Ridge. Every task felt weighted with importance, like one misstep could unravel everything. But they worked steadily, methodically, and by the time Caleb arrived 2 days later with his wagon and his mule, they were as ready as they were going to be. "You two look like hell," Caleb said by way of greeting, his weathered face creasing into a grin. "Thanks," Lydia said dryly. "You're a real comfort." Caleb chuckled and climbed down from his wagon. "Well, hell or not, you got the cattle looking good. I took a walk through the pasture this morning. They're going to turn heads at auction." "You think so?" Ethan asked, trying to keep the hope out of his voice. "I know so," Caleb said firmly. "I've been doing this longer than you've been alive, son. Trust me on this one." Ethan wanted to trust him, but trust felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. They spent the rest of the day loading supplies into the wagons. Feed for the cattle, camping gear for the nights they'd spend on the trail, provisions for themselves. Lydia packed with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before, her movements quick and sure, and Ethan found himself watching her work, marveling at how much had changed in the months since she'd arrived. She'd become part of the ranch in a way that felt permanent, essential, and somewhere along the way she'd become part of him too. He didn't know exactly when it had happened, maybe that night in the barn during the storm, maybe earlier, maybe it had been building from the moment she'd asked him to dance, but it was there now, solid and undeniable. "What are you thinking about?" Lydia asked, breaking into his thoughts. Ethan startled. "Nothing, just getting ready." "Liar," Lydia said, but there was warmth in her voice. "You're worrying again." "I'm always worrying." "I know, it's one of your less charming qualities." Ethan smiled despite himself. "What are my charming qualities?" Lydia paused, pretending to consider. "Well, you make decent coffee, and you don't talk too much. That's something." "High praise," Ethan said. "I'm not done," Lydia said, and now her voice was softer. "You're stubborn as hell, and you don't quit even when you probably should. And you're kind, even when you don't think anyone's watching. Those are good things, Ethan." Ethan's throat tightened, and he didn't trust himself to respond. So he just nodded and went back to work, carrying the warmth of her words with him. They left for Silver Ridge at dawn 2 days later, the cattle moving in a slow, steady line ahead of them. Caleb rode point, his mule picking its way through the muddy trail with the patience of long experience. Lydia drove one of the wagons, and Ethan rode beside her on his mare, Greta, trusting the horse to follow the sounds of the herd. The first day passed without incident. They made good time, covering nearly 15 miles before stopping to camp for the night. Ethan helped Lydia set up their tent while Caleb got a fire going, and they ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread under a sky full of stars. "You ever think about what you'll do if this works?" Lydia asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Ethan looked toward her voice. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if we sell the cattle, pay off the debts, actually come out ahead, what then?" Ethan considered the question. He'd been so focused on surviving, on just making it to the next day, that he hadn't let himself think much beyond the auction. "I guess I'd rebuild, fix up the ranch properly, expand the herd, maybe hire another hand or two." "That's it?" Lydia asked. "Just more of the same?" "What's wrong with that?" "Nothing," Lydia said. "I just thought maybe you'd want something different, something for yourself." Ethan frowned. "The ranch is for myself." "Is it?" Lydia's voice was gentle but pointed. "Or is it because it's all you've known, and you don't know how to want anything else?" Ethan didn't have an answer for that. He sat there, the fire crackling in front of him, and realized she might be right. He'd been so consumed by the fight to keep the ranch that he'd stopped thinking about why he wanted to keep it in the first place. "What about you?" he asked, deflecting. "What do you want?" Lydia was quiet for a long moment. "I want a place that's mine. Not my husband's, not his partner's, not anyone else's. Mine. A place where I can work and build and not have to look over my shoulder wondering when someone's going to take it away." "You've got that," Ethan said. "The ranch is yours," Lydia finished. "Not mine." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan's pulse quickened. "It could be ours." Lydia went very still. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying—" Ethan stopped, swallowed hard. "I'm saying I don't want you to leave when this is over. I'm saying I want you to stay. As a partner. As whatever you want to be." "Ethan, I know I'm not much of a catch," Ethan continued, the words tumbling out now. "I'm blind. I'm broke. I'm barely keeping my head above water. But you make me want to do more than just survive. You make me want to actually live. And if you'll stay, if you'll build this with me, I swear I'll do everything I can to make it worth your while." Lydia's breath caught, and for a moment she didn't speak. Then she reached out, found his hand, and held it tight. "You're an idiot if you think you're not much of a catch." Ethan let out a shaky laugh. "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes," Lydia said, and there was no hesitation in her voice. "I'll stay. We'll build it together." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been wound tight for so long he'd forgotten it was there. He pulled her close, and she came willingly, her head resting against his shoulder, and they sat like that by the fire, the night wrapping around them like a promise. Across the fire, Caleb cleared his throat. "You two done being sappy? Because I'd like to get some sleep." Lydia laughed, and Ethan felt the sound of it vibrate through him. "Yeah, Caleb, we're done." "Good," Caleb muttered. "About damn time, if you ask me." The second day on the trail was harder. The weather turned gray and cold, a biting wind kicking up dust and making the cattle restless. One of the younger steers kept trying to break away from the herd, and Ethan spent half the morning chasing him back into line. By the time they stopped for a midday break, his shoulder was aching from the ride, and his temper was frayed. "That steer's going to be trouble at auction," Caleb said, watching the animal eye the rest of the herd with obvious disdain. "He's young," Lydia said. "He'll settle." "He better," Caleb said. "Buyers don't like flighty cattle." Ethan rubbed his shoulder, trying to work out the knot forming there. "We'll manage." They pushed on, and by late afternoon they crested a ridge and saw Silver Ridge spread out in the valley below. The town looked bigger than Ethan remembered, more bustling, with wagons and horses clogging the main street and pens full of cattle already set up on the outskirts. The auction was still 2 days away, but ranchers had been arriving all week, staking out their spots, getting their herds settled. "There's a lot of competition," Lydia said quietly. "Yeah," Ethan said, his stomach sinking. "There is." They made their way down into town, following Caleb to the auction pens on the east side. A man in a worn hat and dusty boots met them there, clipboard in hand. "Name?" he asked. Ethan Hale, Ethan said. The man consulted his clipboard, then nodded. You're in pen 14. Got space for about 50 head. We've got 41, Ethan said. The man marked something down, then gestured toward a row of pens. Straight back, third on the left. Get 'em settled, and make sure you're registered at the auction house by sundown tomorrow. Thanks, Ethan said, and they moved the herd into the pen. It took the better part of an hour to get the cattle settled and the wagons unloaded. By the time they were done, Ethan was exhausted, his body aching, but there was no time to rest. They needed to check in at the auction house, find a place to stay for the next few days, and figure out what Crowley was up to. I'll handle the auction registration, Lydia said. You and Caleb find us a place to sleep. Ethan wanted to argue, but he could hear the firmness in her voice and knew it was pointless. All right, be careful. Always am, Lydia said, and then she was gone, her boots crunching in the gravel as she headed toward the main street. Caleb led Ethan to a boarding house on the edge of town, a squat building with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The woman who ran it was sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, and she quoted them a price that made Ethan wince. That's robbery, Caleb said. That's auction week, the woman replied. Take it or leave it. They took it. By the time Lydia returned, the sun was setting, and Ethan was sitting on the boarding house porch, nursing a cup of weak coffee. She climbed the steps and sat down beside him, letting out a long breath. How'd it go? Ethan asked. We're registered. Auction's the day after tomorrow, starting at 9 in the morning. They're expecting over 300 head to go through. Ethan's jaw tightened. That's a lot. Yeah, and Crowley's bringing 212 of them. 212, Ethan repeated, the number sinking in like a stone. He's going to flood the market. That's the plan, Lydia said grimly. But we knew that already. We just have to make sure ours stand out. Ethan wanted to believe that would be enough. But sitting there in the growing dark, listening to the sounds of the town around him, he felt the old fear creeping back in. The next day, they spent hours in the auction pens, making sure the cattle looked their best. Lydia brushed them down, checked their hooves, made sure their coats were clean and shining. Ethan moved among them, running his hands over their backs, feeling the weight they'd put on over the past weeks. They were good cattle. Strong, healthy, well-fed. But were they good enough? Around midday, Victor Crowley showed up. Ethan heard his voice first, smooth, confident, carrying across the pens like he owned the place. He was talking to someone, laughing, and Ethan's stomach clenched. Stay calm, Lydia murmured beside him. I'm calm, Ethan lied. Crowley's footsteps approached, and then his voice was right there, too close. Ethan Hale. Didn't expect to see you here. Why wouldn't I be? Ethan asked evenly. Oh, no reason. Just thought you might have come to your senses by now. Crowley's tone was friendly, almost jovial, but there was an edge underneath. These your cattle? They are. Crowley was quiet for a moment, and Ethan knew he was looking them over. Not bad. Not bad at all. Though I have to say, they're not going to hold up against mine. No offense. None taken, Ethan said, though his jaw was tight. Still, Crowley continued, I admire the effort. Takes guts to show up when you know you're outmatched. I'll give you that. We'll see how it goes, Lydia said, her voice cold. Crowley chuckled. Indeed we will, Mrs. Cross. Indeed we will. He started to walk away, then paused. Oh, one more thing, Ethan. That loan of yours? The bank's going to want payment within 30 days of auction. Just wanted to make sure you knew. Ethan's blood ran cold. 30 days? The terms were 60. Terms change, Crowley said lightly. Board voted on it last week. Thought it was only fair to let you know. And then he was gone, his boots crunching away across the gravel, leaving Ethan standing there with his heart pounding and his mind racing. He can't do that, Lydia said, her voice shaking with fury. He can't just change the terms. He's on the board, Ethan said flatly. He can do whatever he wants. Lydia swore, low and vicious, and Ethan felt the same rage boiling up inside him. But beneath the rage was something colder, sharper. Fear. If the payment was due in 30 days, he didn't have time to recover from a bad auction. He didn't have time to find another buyer, negotiate better terms, anything. He either sold well tomorrow or he lost everything. We're going to beat him, Lydia said, and her voice was fierce. You hear me, Ethan? We're going to walk into that auction tomorrow, and we're going to sell every single head for more than he thinks we can, and we're going to shove it down his throat." Ethan wanted to believe her, but the fear was so loud now, drowning out everything else, and he didn't know how to make it stop. That night, Ethan lay awake in the cramped boarding house room, listening to Caleb snore in the bed across from him and Lydia's soft breathing from the cot near the window. He couldn't stop thinking about Crowley's words, about the loan, about everything that could still go wrong. Around midnight, he gave up on sleep and slipped outside. The town was quiet, most people already in bed, and the air was cool and still. He sat on the porch steps, his head in his hands, and tried to quiet the storm in his mind. "You all right?" He looked up, startled. Lydia was standing in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Couldn't sleep," Ethan said. "Yeah, I noticed." She came down the steps and sat beside him. "Talk to me." "I don't know what to say," Ethan admitted. I keep thinking about everything we've put into this. All the work, all the hope. And what if it's not enough? What if we lose anyway?" Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then she took his hand, her fingers warm and strong. "Then we lose, and we get back up, and we try again." "I don't think I have another try in me," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "Yes, you do," Lydia said firmly, "because you're stubborn, and you don't know how to quit, and because I'm not letting you." Ethan let out a shaky breath. "I'm scared, Lydia." "I know," she said. "So am I. But we're going to walk into that auction tomorrow, and we're going to hold our heads up, and we're going to fight, because that's what we do." Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and they sat there together in the dark, drawing strength from each other. The morning of the auction dawned clear and cold, the sky a pale, washed-out blue. Ethan woke early, his stomach in knots, and dressed in his best shirt, a faded blue button-down that Lydia had mended for him the week before. She was already up, her hair pinned back, her face set with determination. "Ready?" she asked. "No," Ethan said honestly, "but let's do it anyway." They made their way to the auction house, a large barn-like structure on the edge of town. It was already packed with ranchers, buyers, and spectators, the air thick with the smell of cattle and sweat and tobacco. Ethan's hands were shaking, and he shoved them into his pockets to hide it. Caleb appeared at his elbow. "Pens are ready. Cattle look good. You just focus on staying calm." "Easier said than done," Ethan muttered. "Most things are," Caleb said, echoing Lydia's words from days before. The auction started promptly at 9. The auctioneer was a broad-shouldered man with a voice that carried like thunder, and he worked through the lots quickly, efficiently. Ethan listened to the rhythm of it, the rapid-fire calls, the shouts from buyers, the slam of the gavel marking each sale. Crowley's cattle went first. Lot after lot, 212 head in total, and the prices were decent, $13 a head, sometimes $14. The buyers were interested, engaged, and Ethan's heart sank with every sale. "That's not bad," Lydia murmured beside him, "but it's not great either." "It's better than I hoped," Ethan said. "We can beat it," Lydia said. "Our cattle are in better condition. The buyers will see that." Ethan wanted to believe her, but the doubt was gnawing at him, relentless and cruel. Finally, their lot was called. Lot 47, Ethan Hale, 41 head. The auctioneer's voice rang out, and Ethan felt Lydia's hand slip into his, grounding him. The bidding started at $10 a head. Ethan's stomach dropped. 10, do I hear 11? 11 from the gentleman in the back, do I hear 12? The bids climbed slowly, 12, 13, and then stalled. Ethan's chest tightened. 13 going once, 13 going twice. 15, a voice called from the back of the room. Ethan's head snapped up. Who was that? I don't know, Lydia whispered. Someone new. The auctioneer's voice picked up again. 15, do I hear 16? 16 from the front, 17 from the back. The bidding climbed higher, 18, 19, and Ethan could barely breathe. His hands were clenched so tight his nails dug into his palms. 20, the voice from the back called again. The room went quiet. $20 a head was more than anyone had paid all day, more than Ethan had dared to hope for. 20 going once, the auctioneer said. 20 going twice? 21, someone else called. Ethan's heart was hammering so hard he thought it might burst. 21 going once, going twice. Sold! To the gentleman in the gray coat for $21 a head. The gavel slammed down, and Ethan felt Lydia's hand tighten around his, her breath coming out in a rush. "We did it," she whispered. "Ethan, we did it." Ethan couldn't speak. The numbers were spinning in his head. 41 head at $21 a head was $861. Enough to pay off the loan, enough to keep the ranch, enough to start rebuilding. They'd won. Caleb clapped him on the back, laughing. "I told you, son. I told you they'd see quality when they saw it." Ethan was still trying to process it when a man approached, the buyer in the gray coat. He was older, maybe 60, with a weathered face and sharp eyes. "Ethan Hale?" the man asked. "That's me," Ethan said. The man extended his hand, and Ethan shook it. "Name's Robert Finch. I run a freight operation out of Denver. I've been looking for good stock, and yours caught my eye. Those cattle are well fed, well cared for. That's rare these days." "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice rough. "I'd like to do business with you again," Finch said. "If you're interested." Ethan glanced toward Lydia, who was smiling so wide it looked like it hurt. "Yeah," he said. "I think we'd be interested." Finch nodded, tipped his hat, and walked away, leaving Ethan standing there, still half in shock. "We did it," Lydia said again, and this time she was laughing. "We actually did it." Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, and for the first time in years he felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. They collected the payment that afternoon, and Ethan handed most of it over to the bank representative on the spot, settling the loan with $3 to spare. The relief was so intense it made him dizzy, and he had to sit down on the steps of the bank just to catch his breath. "You all right?" Lydia asked, sitting beside him. "Yeah," Ethan said. I didn't think we'd make it." "I know," Lydia said. "But we did." Ethan turned toward her, wishing he could see her face. "I couldn't have done this without you." "Yes, you could have," Lydia said, "but I'm glad you didn't have to." They sat there together, the town bustling around them, and Ethan felt something settle inside him. The fight wasn't over. It never really was, out here on the frontier, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a real chance, and he wasn't facing it alone. That night, they celebrated at the boarding house with Caleb, sharing a bottle of whiskey that Caleb had been saving for a special occasion. They toasted to the sale, to the ranch, to the future, and Ethan let himself relax for the first time in months. "What now?" Caleb asked, pouring another round. "Now we go home," Ethan said, "and we rebuild. And we do it right this time," Lydia added. "No more just barely holding on. We build something that lasts." Caleb raised his glass. "To building something that lasts." They clinked glasses, and Ethan felt the warmth of the whiskey spread through him, chasing away the last of the fear. They'd won, and that was enough. The ride back to the ranch felt different than the journey out. The same trail, the same mud, the same cold wind cutting across the valley. But everything had shifted. Ethan could feel it in the way Lydia hummed quietly to herself as she drove the wagon, in the lightness of Caleb's chatter, in the absence of the weight that had been pressing on his chest for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. They'd won. The words kept echoing in his head, and every time they did, a part of him waited for something to take it away. But nothing did. The money was real. The debt was paid. The ranch was his. Theirs, he corrected himself, glancing toward where Lydia sat on the wagon bench. Theirs now. "You're quiet," Lydia said, breaking into his thoughts. "Just thinking," Ethan said. "About what?" "About how strange it feels. Not owing anyone, not waiting for the next disaster." Lydia was quiet for a moment. "It'll take some getting used to." "Yeah," Ethan agreed. "It will." They made camp that night near a creek, the water running high and fast from the snowmelt. Caleb built a fire, and they sat around it eating salt pork and beans, the stars coming out overhead in thick, glittering clusters. Ethan tilted his head back, listening to the crackle of the fire and the rush of the creek, and let himself feel something he hadn't allowed in a long time. Hope. "What's the first thing you're going to fix when we get back?" Caleb asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Ethan considered. "Barn roof, then the fences on the south pasture. After that, maybe the porch steps. They've been loose for 2 years. "That's a lot of work," Caleb said. "We've got time now," Lydia said, and money to hire help if we need it. Ethan nodded. Robert Finch said he'd be interested in buying from us again next year. If we can build the herd back up, maybe even expand it, we could have a real business. You sound like a man with a plan, Caleb said, and there was approval in his voice. I sound like a man who's trying not to get ahead of himself, Ethan said. But yeah, I've got ideas. Lydia reached over and squeezed his hand. Good. I like a man with ideas. Caleb chuckled. You two are disgustingly happy, you know that? Jealous? Lydia shot back. Nah, Caleb said. Just glad to see it. Been a long time since Ethan had anything to be happy about. Ethan didn't argue. It was true. And sitting there by the fire, Lydia's hand warm in his, he realized just how much had changed. Not just the ranch, not just the money, but him. He wasn't the same man who'd stood alone at that harvest dance, invisible and bitter. He'd been forced to let someone in, and it had saved him. They reached the ranch 2 days later, and Ethan felt a rush of relief when he heard the familiar creak of the gate, the soft lowing of the few cattle they'd left behind. Home. It felt like home again, not just a place he was desperately clinging to. I'll get the horses settled, Caleb said, climbing down from his wagon. You two go on inside. You've earned a rest. Thanks, Caleb, Ethan said. Lydia took Ethan's arm, and they walked up to the house together. The porch steps groaned under their weight, and Ethan made a mental note to fix them tomorrow. But tonight, he just wanted to sit down and not move for a while. Inside, the house was cold and a little dusty, but it felt like a sanctuary. Lydia got a fire going in the stove while Ethan slumped into a chair at the kitchen table, his body aching from days on the trail. When the fire was roaring, Lydia made coffee, and they sat together in the warm kitchen, steam rising from their cups. We did it, Lydia said softly. We did, Ethan agreed. I keep waiting for it to feel real, Lydia said. Like any minute now, I'm going to wake up and find out it was all a dream. I know the feeling, Ethan said. But it's real. We're here. The ranch is ours, and we've got a chance to actually build something now. Lydia smiled, and Ethan could hear it in her voice. So what do we build? Whatever we want, Ethan said. That's the best part. We get to decide. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. And then Lydia spoke again, her voice quieter. Ethan, there's something I need to tell you. Ethan's stomach tightened. What is it? Nothing bad, Lydia said quickly. At least I don't think it is. But I've been thinking about what comes next, and I realized I don't want to just be your partner on paper. I want this to be real, legal. I want us to be... She hesitated, and Ethan could hear the uncertainty in her voice. I want us to be married, if you'll have me. Ethan's breath caught. He'd thought about it, of course he had, but hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way that terrified and thrilled him all at once. You want to marry me? He asked, his voice rough. Yes, Lydia said simply. I do. Ethan reached across the table, found her hand, and held it tight. Then yes, absolutely yes. Lydia let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. Really? Really, Ethan said. I can't think of anything I want more. Lydia stood, came around the table, and kissed him. It was gentle and fierce all at once, and when she pulled back, Ethan could feel her smiling. When? She asked. As soon as we can arrange it, Ethan said. I don't want to wait. Good, Lydia said. Neither do I. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Silver Ridge, with Caleb as witness and a handful of townspeople in attendance. Ethan wore his best suit, the one he'd bought years ago for Claire's funeral and hadn't touched since. Lydia wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself, and when she took his hand at the altar, Ethan felt like the luckiest man alive. The ceremony was short, practical, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed Lydia in front of everyone, not caring who saw or what they thought. This was his life now, their life, and he wasn't going to hide it. Afterward, they had a small gathering at the ranch. Caleb brought a roasted chicken, Tom Holloway from the feed store brought a pie, and a few other people from town showed up with food and well wishes. Even old Mrs. Brennan came, leaning on her cane and offering Lydia a quilt she'd made as a wedding gift. It's beautiful, Lydia said, running her hands over the intricate stitching. You'll need it come winter, Mrs. Brennan said, and I figured you two deserve something nice. You've had a hard road. Thank you, Lydia said, and there were tears in her voice. Mrs. Brennan patted her hand. You're doing good work here. Don't let anyone tell you different. Ethan stood on the porch, listening to the sounds of people laughing and talking in his yard, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Belonging. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't the blind rancher people whispered about and avoided. He was Ethan Hale, and he had a wife, a home, and a future. As the sun started to set, the guests began to leave, and soon it was just Ethan and Lydia standing on the porch, watching the last of the wagons disappear down the road. That was nice, Lydia said. It was, Ethan agreed. You happy? Lydia asked. Ethan considered the question. Happy felt like a big word, one he wasn't sure he knew how to hold yet. But it was close. Yeah, he said. I think I am. Lydia leaned against him, and they stood there together as the sky turned purple and the first stars came out. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the cattle shifted in the pasture. The ranch was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time in as long as Ethan could remember, it felt like everything was exactly where it should be. The weeks that followed were busy. Ethan hired 2 new hands, young men from town who needed work and were willing to learn. With their help, they repaired the barn roof, replaced the broken fences, and started clearing land for a second pasture. Lydia kept the books, managed the supplies, and negotiated with buyers in a way that made Ethan glad he'd married someone smarter than he was. Robert Finch came through on his promise and placed an order for cattle the following spring, which gave them a goal to work toward. Ethan started building the herd back up, buying young stock from neighboring ranches and trading favors for breeding rights. It was slow work, unglamorous, but it was steady. And steady, Ethan was learning, was enough. One afternoon in late summer, Ethan was working in the barn when he heard a horse approaching. He stepped outside, wiping his hands on his jeans, and waited. Ethan Hale? A voice called. That's me, Ethan said. The rider dismounted, and Ethan heard the creak of leather, the jingle of spurs. Name's James Porter. I'm with the Cattlemen's Association out of Denver. Heard about your sale at auction last spring. Impressive numbers. Ethan's stomach tightened. He didn't know what the Cattlemen's Association wanted, but he doubted it was good news. What can I do for you? I'm here to extend an invitation, Porter said. We're looking for ranchers who demonstrate quality stock and good management practices. We'd like you to join the association. It comes with benefits. Access to better markets, connections with buyers, support during hard seasons. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. You want me to join? That's right, Porter said. We think you'd be a good fit. Ethan didn't know what to say. A year ago, he'd been on the verge of losing everything. Now the Cattlemen's Association was inviting him to join their ranks. I'll need to talk to my wife, Ethan said finally. Porter chuckled. Smart man. Talk it over and let me know. Here's my card. He pressed a piece of paper into Ethan's hand, climbed back onto his horse, and rode off. Ethan stood there, turning the card over in his fingers, and felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Lydia was thrilled when he told her, this is exactly what we needed. Access to better markets means better prices, and better prices mean we can keep growing. You think we should do it? Ethan asked. Absolutely, Lydia said. This is proof that what we're doing is working, Ethan. People are noticing. Ethan nodded, the weight of it settling over him. They'd come so far, and there was still so much further they could go. Fall came, and with it, the first frost. Ethan and Lydia spent long days preparing for winter, stocking hay, reinforcing shelters, making sure the cattle were in good condition. It was hard work, but it didn't feel desperate anymore. It felt purposeful. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Lydia looked up from the ledger she'd been working on. We're going to turn a profit this year. Ethan turned toward her. You're sure? I'm sure, Lydia said. Not a huge profit, but enough to put some money aside. Maybe buy a few more head in the spring. Ethan let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. A profit. A profit, Lydia confirmed, and there was satisfaction in her voice. Ethan leaned back in his chair, letting the fire warm his face, and thought about how far they'd come. From the edge of ruin to profit. From alone to married. From hopeless to hopeful. Thank you, he said quietly. Lydia looked up. For what? For not giving up on me, Ethan said. For staying when you could have left. For fighting when I wanted to quit. Lydia set the ledger aside and came to sit beside him. You don't have to thank me for that. I didn't do it because I'm some kind of saint. I did it because I wanted to, because you were worth it. I don't know if I was, Ethan said. Well, I do, Lydia said firmly, and you don't get to argue with me about it. Ethan huffed a laugh. Yes, ma'am. They sat together in comfortable silence, and Ethan realized something. He'd spent so long thinking of himself as broken, as less than, that he'd forgotten he was still a person capable of building something good. Lydia had seen that when he couldn't, and in seeing it, she'd helped him see it too. Winter arrived in earnest, but this time Ethan wasn't afraid. They had enough supplies, enough money, enough help. When the first snow fell, blanketing the ranch in white, Ethan stood on the porch with Lydia and felt nothing but peace. It's beautiful, Lydia said. Is it? Ethan asked. Yeah, Lydia said. Everything's covered in snow. The barn, the pastures, the mountains in the distance. It looks like a painting. Ethan closed his eyes and tried to picture it. He couldn't see it the way Lydia did, but he could feel it. The cold air on his skin, the smell of wood smoke, the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. It was enough. Tell me what else you see, Ethan said. Lydia took his hand. I see a ranch that's thriving. I see cattle that are healthy and strong. I see a barn that doesn't leak anymore, and fences that actually hold. I see a home. Ethan smiled. So do I. They stood there together, the snow falling around them, and Ethan thought about everything they'd been through. The storms, the struggles, the moments when it felt like the world was trying to break them. They'd survived all of it, not because they were perfect, but because they'd refused to quit. As winter deepened, Victor Crowley made one last attempt to assert his dominance. He showed up at the ranch on a bitter January morning, flanked by his brother Martin and another man Ethan didn't recognize. Ethan, Crowley said, his voice cold, we need to talk. I don't have anything to say to you, Ethan replied, standing on the porch with his arms crossed. Well, I have something to say to you, Crowley said. You embarrassed me at that auction, made me look weak in front of buyers. I don't appreciate that. I didn't do anything to you, Ethan said. I just sold my cattle. You sold them for more than mine, Crowley snapped. That reflects poorly on me. Then maybe you should have taken better care of your stock, Lydia said, stepping out onto the porch beside Ethan. Crowley's jaw tightened. This doesn't concern you, Mrs. Hale. It does when you're standing on my porch threatening my husband, Lydia said, her voice like ice. I'm not threatening anyone, Crowley said. I'm simply stating facts. This isn't over, Ethan. You might have won this round, but there will be others, and next time you won't be so lucky. Get off my property, Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous. Crowley stared at him for a long moment, and then he turned and walked back to his horse. This isn't over, he said again, and then he rode off, his men following. Lydia let out a breath. That man is insufferable. Yeah, Ethan said, but he's also powerless now. He tried to ruin us, and we're still here. That's what's eating at him. You think he'll come back? Lydia asked. Maybe, Ethan said, but if he does, we'll handle it. Together. Lydia nodded, and they went back inside, leaving Crowley and his threats behind. Spring came slowly that year, the snow melting in fits and starts, the ground thawing into mud before finally drying out. Ethan and Lydia worked side by side, preparing for the new season. They bought 12 more head of cattle, young and healthy, and set about building the herd. The 2 hands they'd hired proved reliable, and Caleb came by regularly to help with the heavier work. One afternoon in late April, Ethan was in the barn when Lydia came to find him. Ethan, you need to come see this, she said, and there was excitement in her voice. What is it? Ethan asked, setting down the harness he'd been mending. Just come, Lydia said, taking his hand. She led him outside, across the yard, and into the pasture. The grass was starting to green up, and Ethan could hear the cattle grazing nearby. Look, Lydia said, and then she guided his hand to one of the cows. Feel here. Ethan ran his hand over the cow's side, and his breath caught. There was a calf nursing, small and warm and alive. When did this happen? Ethan asked. This morning, Lydia said. And there are 2 more over there, 3 healthy calves, Ethan. The herd's growing. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. 3 calves. It wasn't much, but it was the start of something, proof that they were building, not just surviving. "This is good," he said, his voice thick. "This is really good," Lydia agreed. They stood there together, listening to the calves and their mothers, and Ethan felt a surge of pride. This was what they'd been working for. This was the future. By the time summer rolled around, the ranch was unrecognizable from what it had been a year ago. The fences were solid, the barn was repaired, and the herd had grown to over 60 head. Ethan and Lydia had settled into a rhythm, each knowing their role, each trusting the other to do their part. One evening in July, they sat on the porch watching the sun set, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. Lydia was resting her head on Ethan's shoulder, and he had his arm around her, holding her close. "You ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't asked you to dance that night?" Lydia asked. Ethan considered the question. "I try not to. It's too depressing." "Yeah," Lydia said. "Me too." "Why'd you do it?" Ethan asked. "Really? Why'd you take that chance?" Lydia was quiet for a moment. "Because I saw something in you that night, something stubborn and unbreakable. And I thought, if he can still stand there and face a room full of people who've written him off, maybe I can too. You gave me hope, Ethan. I just wanted to give some back." Ethan's chest tightened, and he pulled her closer. "You gave me more than hope. You gave me a reason to keep going." "We gave each other that," Lydia said softly. "That's how it works, I think. You hold me up when I'm falling, and I hold you up when you are. And somehow, we make it through." Ethan nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. She was right. They'd saved each other. And in doing so, they'd built something worth saving. As the days grew shorter and fall approached again, Ethan started thinking about the future in a way he never had before. Not just the next season or the next year, but decades from now. What would this ranch look like in 10 years, 20? What kind of legacy were they building? One night, he shared those thoughts with Lydia as they sat by the fire. "I want this place to last," he said, "not just for us, but for whoever comes after. I want it to be something people point to and say, they built that. They made something out of nothing." Lydia smiled. "We're already doing that, Ethan. Every fence we fix, every calf that's born, every season we survive, that's the legacy. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be ours." Ethan thought about that. She was right, of course. The ranch wasn't perfect. The barn still creaked in the wind, the fences still needed constant repair, and there were always setbacks. But it was theirs. They'd built it with their own hands, their own sweat, their own refusal to give up. And that was worth more than perfection. "You're smarter than me, you know that?" Ethan said. "I know," Lydia said, grinning, "but I love you anyway." Ethan laughed, and the sound of it felt good. Easy, like something he'd forgotten how to do and was finally remembering. When the second auction came around that fall, Ethan and Lydia brought 30 head to market, healthy, well-fed, exactly the kind of stock buyers were looking for. Robert Finch was there, and he bought the entire lot at $22 a head, even higher than the year before. As they loaded the money into their wagon and started the journey home, Ethan felt a sense of accomplishment he'd never experienced before. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were succeeding. And the difference between those two things was everything. Winter came again, but this time it felt different. They were prepared, stocked with supplies, the herd in good condition, the ranch solid. When the first snow fell, Ethan and Lydia stood on the porch together, wrapped in the quilt Mrs. Brennan had given them, and watched it come down. "Another winter," Lydia said. "Another winter," Ethan agreed. "But we've got this one." "We do," Lydia said. "And the next one. And the one after that." Ethan smiled. "You sound pretty confident." "I am," Lydia said, "because I've got you and you've got me. And as long as that's true, we can handle anything." Ethan turned toward her, wishing for the 1,000th time that he could see her face. But even without sight, he could feel her strength, her determination, her love. And that was enough. "I'm glad you asked me to dance," he said quietly. "So am I," Lydia said. "Best decision I ever made." They stood there as the snow fell around them, the ranch quiet and peaceful, and Ethan thought about how much had changed. He'd gone from a man who'd lost everything to a man who had everything that mattered. Not wealth, not fame, not even sight, but a home, a partner, a purpose. And maybe that was the real lesson in all of this. That strength wasn't about never falling. It was about getting back up every time you did. That hope wasn't about believing everything would work out. It was about choosing to keep going even when you didn't know if it would. And that love wasn't about finding someone perfect. It was about finding someone willing to fight beside you, even when the fight seemed impossible. Ethan had learned all of that the hard way. Through storms and struggles, through loss and fear, through moments when he'd wanted to give up, and moments when he'd been forced to keep going. And he'd learned it because Lydia had been there, refusing to let him fall alone. They'd built something together. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And in a world that tried to break people like them, that was the greatest victory of all. As the winter deepened and the nights grew longer, Ethan found himself thinking about the future less and appreciating the present more. The warmth of the fire, the sound of Lydia's voice, the quiet satisfaction of work well done. These were the things that mattered. These were the things worth fighting for. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Lydia spoke. "Ethan, I've been thinking." "About what?" Ethan asked. "About next year, about what we want to do, where we want to go. And I realized I don't need to go anywhere. This is where I want to be, with you, on this ranch, building this life." Ethan felt his chest tighten with emotion. "Yeah, me too." "Good," Lydia said, "because I wasn't planning to leave." They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them, and Ethan felt a peace settle over him that he'd never known before. He'd spent so long fighting just to survive that he'd forgotten what it felt like to simply live. But he was learning now. One day at a time, one moment at a time, he was learning. And as the winter passed and spring came again, bringing with it new calves and new beginnings, Ethan understood something fundamental about himself and about the world. That broken didn't mean finished, that darkness didn't mean defeat, and that sometimes the people who had the least reason to hope were the ones who held on to it the hardest. He'd been that person once, standing alone in a room full of people who'd written him off, believing he had nothing left to offer. And then Lydia had crossed that floor, extended her hand, and reminded him that he was still here, still standing, still capable of building something worth having. They'd saved each other. And in doing so, they'd proven that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let someone else be strong for you. That asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And that the people who survive aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who refuse to stay down. Ethan Hale had learned all of that on a failing ranch in the middle of nowhere, in the company of a woman who'd had every reason to walk away and didn't. And now, standing on the porch of a home they'd built together, listening to the sounds of a ranch that was finally thriving, he understood the most important truth of all. That life wasn't about the hand you were dealt. It was about what you chose to do with it. And he and Lydia had chosen to fight, to build, to refuse to let the world tell them they were finished. They'd won, not because everything was perfect, but because they were still here, still trying, still together. And as the stars came out overhead, stars Ethan couldn't see but could feel in the cool night air, in the vastness of the sky, in the quiet promise of another day, he knew that this was enough. This was everything.